You're listening to WSUW 91.7 FM in Whitewater, Wisconsin. This is Rashkin Report, and I'm your host, Yuri Rashkin. I'm excited to welcome to the program Yuri Felshtinsky. Yuri is a Russian-American historian. And, Yuri, welcome to the program. It's quite an honor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
Yuri has authored a number of books on Russian history. According to, I understand that Wikipedia is not the most reliable source, so please correct me if I'm wrong. Mr. Felshtinsky's books include The Bolsheviks and the Left SRs in Paris, 1985, Towards a History of Our Isolation, London, and then in Moscow, republished, The Failure of the World Revolution, published in London in 91 and then in Moscow in 92, Blowing Up Russia with Alexander Litvinenko, whose name perhaps will come up yet, and finally The Age of Assassins with Vladimir Prablovsky, whose name doesn't sound as familiar to me as some of the other names mentioned. Yuri, let me begin with this. Your last book was The Age of Assassins. Is there a chance that your next book is going to have something to do about hackers?
Well, this is not the last book, by the way. It was published first in Britain as The Age of Assassins. It later was published in the United States as The Corporation, Russia and KGB in the Age of President Putin. And it was, by the way, later again republished in Britain as Putin's System or something like this. But this is not the last book anyway. The last book is World War III, The Battle for Ukraine. Since 2014, of course, we have major developments when Russia invaded Crimea.
So do you anticipate that technology and hackers and some kind of whether is this even can this be called Cold War II, or is it something entirely different that we're looking at as far as potential threat coming from Russia in the future?
Well, I think it is coming. It is started in 2008 with Georgia. It was continued through 2014 when Russia occupied Crimea and eastern Ukraine. We see that Russia constantly is raising the level of danger and trying to compete with the United States in creating conflicts in order to deal with conflicts, in order to force the United States to deal with Russia to finish the conflict. In other words, since Russia is not able to compete economically, because all they do sell the raw materials like oil and gas and metals to the world, they try to create in conflict negotiation. And this is, they do successfully. We see it in Ukraine, where they first invaded Ukraine in order to start negotiations about peace in Ukraine. We see it in Syria, where Russia intervened with the idea to extend the war. And this is very different from the American idea to win the war. And you see, the point is not whether American policy towards Syria, for example, is correct or right or wrong. It might be wrong. It might be wrong. But intentions which Americans have are completely different from intentions which Russia has. Russia invaded into Syria in order to be sure that the war will never end. And Americans, of course, intervened with the hopes that they would be able to achieve peace. The same with technology. We do know that Russia today has more spies in the United States than the Soviet Union had during the worst years of the Cold War. This is not a secret. This information was published basically officially by State Department. Everybody is upset and puzzled with this. Russia spends a lot of money on propaganda. We see it all because We hear Russian TV, we hear Russian news stations which are broadcasting in the United States and in Europe. The rhetoric is very tough and unfair. It's darker than, again, it was in the worst years of the Soviet regime. Russia is spending money to raise the level of danger and to raise the level of conflict with the United States in a hope that they will force the United States to accept Russia as an equal partner.
Well, then I think the next question that seems natural to me is, do you think that making a deal with the Russians is even something that exists, or is it just a continuous process where, unless, I guess, stopped by force, Russian side will just continue pushing as far as they can?
Well, I think it's fair to say that we deal with Russia. We deal with Russia every day the way we were dealing with the Soviet Union prior to 91, because the alternative of dealing with Russia is to fight against Russia, and no one is fighting against Russia, at least yet. You see, it's only in Russia people think that America has the goal to destroy Russia or to weaken Russia or to destabilize Russia. In reality, it's the opposite. America has the goal to have Russia as partner. Believe it or not, even now after 2008 in Georgia and especially after 2014 in Ukraine, America still has this goal to have Russia as a partner.
And doesn't it have to do a lot to do with also China and the role that Russia could play in this kind of a three-party relationship? Well,
you see, each country with which we are dealing now, and this would include the United States, China, and Russia, are so difficult to understand, and they're so different that if we add to this American-China talk or American-Russian talk another side like China, I think we will complicate the situation very much.
In what case? And then, in what sense do you mean partners? That the United States is looking at Russia as a partner?
Well, since 91, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were years when relations between Russia and the United States were very warm. I do remember, I heard with my own ears, because I was in Russia during those months when President Putin, being prime minister, announced that Russia will join NATO. That's how warm and how good those relations were. Now, since 2000, when Putin came to power as president, things started to change slowly. And by the time of 2008, I would say, by the time of invasion into Georgia, everything was different. Now, no one actually paid attention to Georgia. This was a major mistake of American foreign diplomacy, if you would ask me, and we pay for this in 2014 with the new level of invasion to Crimea. And you see, now we have constantly small incidents when Russia is flying over the borders of European states or swimming near the waters or in the waters of Scandinavian states. We actually facing a situation when blackmail is involved and the Russian government on a very high level, this would include even President Putin, would actually blackmail the West that if conflict would come, Russia would use nuclear weapons. We are facing situations when Putin, for example, visiting Finland openly tells them that if Finland would think about joining NATO, Russia would use force against Finland, etc., etc. So Russia is trying to be respected through the force. This is very, very, I would say, natural for Russia. If you ask Russians, because since both you and me, since we speak Russian, we know very well the expression «боишься, значит уважаешь». Being respected is being to be afraid of.
Or fear means respect.
Right, or fear means respect, right, in reverse, sorry. But the result is that Russia is trying to create a situation when everybody is afraid of Russia, confusing respect and fear.
So, we are just a few days currently before the election in the United States, and we have two possible candidates. I think there's some presumptions that can be made about who might win, but let's take a look at both Mr. Trump and Mrs. Clinton as far as their relationship with Russia. You have such a unique perspective. I just really appreciate it. And once again, you're listening to Rashkin Report. This is Yuri Rashkin, and my guest is Russian-American historian Yuri Felshtinsky. Yuri, as I have, but much earlier, left Soviet Union and then actually came back and again, according to Wikipedia, correct me if I'm wrong, defended your doctorate back in Russia. You kind of, did it again, and thus became the first non-Russian citizen to earn a doctorate from a Russian university. So you have kind of I think, a good perspective, both being grounded in the American side and the Russian side. How do you see the relationship between Trump and Putin, or Clinton and Putin, as far as Russian-American relations?
Well, by the way, this happened in 92 or 93 when the Russian Academy of Science gave me the degree of Doctor of History. I guess now this would never happen because I have a lot of difficulties now to publish my books and my articles in Russia. But speaking about current relations, we do know, of course, that they are very painful and very nervous this time. This is not how this always was for those who live here for many years. We, of course, do remember that this was not the same every 4 years. But I'm slightly confused with the fact that during all this campaign, with a very aggressive rhetoric, especially when you listen to Donald Trump, you do not hear a single critical word relation to Putin or Russia, meaning Russian foreign policy. This is
I think Donald Trump has made more fun of his wife than of Mr. Putin.
Well, that's true, and this is very strange for me, because indeed this is very damaging for Trump, and this is so obvious that this is damaging for Trump, that the easiest way out of this tricky situation would be to start to criticize Putin, like say, I do not like Putin, I have a lot of difficulties with Russian foreign policy, etc., etc. We do not hear this, and this puzzles me. This puzzles me a lot, because this unfortunately leads to a certain conclusion, and there is nothing what I may do with myself. But this leads me to a conclusion that there is a certain agreement between Trump and the Russian government or President Putin, because there is no other explanation why we do not hear a single word of criticism related to Putin towards Trump, which I repeat, it's kind of self-damaging for Trump not to criticize Russia. And I do not like his position towards NATO, of course. I think this is very crucial for the United States to support NATO and to be active partner of NATO. I do understand that this costs money, but the alternative is unfortunately more dangerous and more expensive, because we do know that the United States were not involved in Europe prior to the First World War, and they were not involved in European affairs prior to the Second World War, and in both cases we had world wars as the result. Europe is not able, this sounds strange and primitive, but that's what it is. Europe is not able to live in peace by itself. The only reason why Europe is in peace was the American influence over European foreign policy and European affairs. And if you destroy NATO, if America withdraw from Europe because it's expensive, and this is Trump is taking a very business-like approach towards foreign policy, at the end, we are going to pay more, because we know that the moment NATO is weakened, or the moment NATO is dissolved, Russia would take control over major European states, territories which partially belonged to the Soviet Union prior to 1991, and who knows, maybe belonged to the Russian Empire prior to 1917. Putin declared his ambitions in 2008, in 2014. He stated many times, quite openly. By the way, I have to say that Putin is very honest in his desires and in his policy. He's openly saying what he is planning to do. And whether we call this plans, the recreation of Soviet Union, or the creation of a new kind of Russian empire or a Russian world, this doesn't really matter. What does matter that Putin is looking at the world in a very simple way, that there are territories which should be part of this new Russia. And every time we are talking about Russian policy, we are actually talking about Russia, the Russian state, which is enlarging its territory. Either this is South Ossetia, or Crimea, or Eastern Ukraine. It's working in one direction. Russia is taking territory after territory, and this never happened in Europe since 1995.
Now, Trump said that if he and Putin got along, what would be so bad about that? That would be so bad, he says. And I think there's a fair number of people out there that do think that why shouldn't we get along with Russia?
Well,
so what would that mean?
It would be, brilliant and very good if everybody would live in peace. The problem is that Putin is not ready to live in peace unless his conditions are met. And we know what his conditions are. His conditions are that Russia is recognized as an equal partner in foreign policy. And for Putin, this means that basically Russia is allowed to do whatever it feels necessary to do. And if Russia feels necessary to invade Georgia, Russia may invade Georgia. If Russia feels necessary to invade Ukraine and unite Ukraine with the Russian Federation, then Ukraine should be part of the Russian Federation. The same about Pridnestrovia or Trieste district. The same is about the Baltic states. There are people in Russia, and we are talking not about common people on the street. We are talking about high-level Russian officials who are mentioning that Finland belonged to the Russian Empire. We're even talking about people who are mentioning that Alaska once belonged to the Russian Empire. So my point is that unfortunately there is no end to the foreign ambitions of the current Russian government. And if you remember, in March of 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea and occupied Crimea quite quickly without basically a single shot fired. Well, indeed, just one person was killed, technically speaking. Everybody was ready to accept the fact that Crimea would belong to Russia. And from different angles of the world, both in the United States and in Europe, we heard the same message sent to Putin from the highest level, from the government of European countries and the United States, from a very high level. Just tell us that this is the end of foreign ambitions of the Russian state, and we will continue to live as we lived before. Indeed, Putin gave his famous speech that the collapse of the Soviet Union is a major personal and geopolitical tragedy for him, and he is starting to correct mistakes made in 1991. So there is no end of those ambitions. It's not that Americans do not want to live in peace in Russia. Americans would like to live in peace with Russia. But the price which Putin is asking for this has no limit. And here we have to probably come back to a question about difference between Clinton and Trump, at least in rhetoric when we deal with programs which are announced. Trump, as I noticed, did not say a single bad word about Putin, and he does it for a reason. We may guess what his reasons are, but I'm sure he has his reasons not to criticize Russia and Putin. Clinton, as we remember, when Russia invaded Crimea, and I do not want to say that I'm, a huge fan of Clinton and her foreign policy when she was Secretary of State. Nevertheless, she did compare Putin to Hitler. She did mention that this is the first, invasion of a European state by another major European state since 1945. So, Clinton is a traditional American bureaucrat who is going to conduct traditional American foreign policy, and this foreign policy demands, participation in the world affairs. This foreign policy does not conclude that if the project is expensive, we do not deal with it, or that if Europe would like to have NATO, they have to pay for this, or that America should withdraw from Middle East because it's too expensive and too dangerous. It is too expensive, it is too dangerous, but this is the difference between the United States being the great world power and, a middle-level European or any other state which exists in the world, and try to stay neutral and try not to participate in those conflicts because this is dangerous, because this is expensive, and because this is a role which typically belongs to the great powers. So I think with Clinton, we will see what we usually see, whether we like it or not. And once again, there is a a lot of room for criticism. What Obama was doing during these 8 years, and what Americans are doing or not doing in relations to other countries and regimes. But at least with Clinton, I think we know what we may expect or will not expect. With Trump, we do not know what we are risking. And I think this might be dangerous in the end.
You're listening to 91.7 FM, WSUW in Whitewater, Wisconsin. This is Rashkin Report, and I'm your host, Yuri Rashkin. My guest today is Yuri Felshtinsky, a Russian-American historian. Yuri, then, with the situation as you described, I guess I will say, make a judgment call that, in my opinion, the West has its own problems and is hoping that the Russian people will take care of things at home, which doesn't seem to be happening, which, in my opinion, is that Russian people are just really do not work together enough to be able to create change. However, there's at least some consistency that I'm seeing on the part of this Russian opposition, disorganized as it is to push for the idea of greater sanctions that West and especially United States should impose on Russia. What is your thoughts on the idea of sanctions, or is there a different approach that you would recommend that would effectively deal with Putin's regime?
Well, of course, I'm for sanctions if we are choosing between yes or no, but unfortunately, this is too little, too late. If we would start with sanctions in 2008 after invasion of Georgia, the invasion of Crimea probably would never take place. If we would be tough with Russia in March of 2014 after invasion of Crimea, the invasion of eastern Ukraine would never take place. But you see, as I mentioned, we were quiet after 2008, and we basically accepted the annexation of Crimea in March of 2014. And then Putin, and this should be expected, I mean, this was not surprise at all, decided that this is a sign that he could proceed further. And the Russian army was concentrated, as we remember, of course, in April, May, along the Russian-Ukrainian border, and started invasion of Ukraine, eastern Ukraine. Now, at that point, Europe decided that this is enough. And at that point, Europe declared sanctions, and America became very tough in rhetoric, and basically people were mentioning the war which is about to start. Probably because of this, not because of the result of those sanctions. Putin stopped, and he didn't proceed with the invasion of Ukraine as a state, and Ukraine was, be able to survive the crisis. We do know that in April, May, we do remember this, a Russian army was conducting exercises all over Russia, like every second day. A Russian fleet and Russian Air Force was actively trying to fly over the borders of the European states and NATO states, including Great Britain, including the United States. Putin, as a small child, was testing the limits, and when he realized that those limits are tested and Russia probably is facing the risk of starting full-scale war with NATO, they decided to stop. And at one point, they, instead of invading Ukraine, ironically, they invaded Syria and started to develop new conflict with NATO in Syria. And this conflict, very successfully for Russia, I have to say, continues until now. The major goal, again, is not to allow this war to end. And in this sense, Russian policy towards Syria is victorious.
Yuri, I guess I would have to disagree, but I suppose that's okay.
That's fine. Especially now during this campaign,
right?
Do not find too many people who would agree on something. It's much easier to find people who disagree.
Well, no, I think in general I'm agreeing with you, but in this particular instance, it seems to me that the Syria campaign may have had some successes, and it showed that dropping bombs kills people, and Russia was successful in doing that in Chechnya and Grozny during that war, but it doesn't seem to really work as well on a world stage where there's other organizations and stakeholders and players involved, and it seems that Russia and Putin are looking just more, well, Kremlin and Putin is solidifying its status as war criminals between what they did in Syria and also with the downing of the Boeing plane over Ukraine. It's kind of solidifying a really not a good image that I don't know that Putin is able to fix.
Well, unfortunately, and here's the problem, he does not have to fix it. He is still flying to other countries. He is still invited for international negotiations, for international meetings. He is still friendly, at least, publicly with leaders of the other states. So the isolation, which we hope would be result of Russian foreign policy, did not take place. I mean, after invasion of Ukraine in 2014, we hoped that the level of isolation of Russian officials abroad would become, very, very open, especially, for example, after the British court was brave enough to announce Mr. Putin to be part of this major operation to kill a British citizen Litvinenko in London with nuclear poisoning. But even this did not help, you see, and this is the problem. That's why Putin does not feel that he has to be, nice to the Western world. They do believe in force. You mentioned the two Chechen wars, and this is precisely the problem. What Russia indicated to the whole world during those two Chechen wars, they're not to lose. They're not afraid to lose people, and they're not afraid to kill people. And Russia was losing, dozens of thousands of their own soldiers, and killing dozens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of Chechens. So Russia is not afraid to kill. And we see it in Syria as well. Russia basically does not care how many people they would have to kill on the way to quote-unquote victory. And there is nothing what the world could do. And this, when I'm saying that Russian policy in Syria is successful, I measure success not by the amount of peaceful negotiations or agreements. I'm measuring it for Russia by their ability, by its ability to stop the peace process in Syria and to help Sadat to keep power, because we know that it's probably because of Russia he's still in power. I doubt he would be able to survive without the assistance of the Russian army. So that's what's happening. Once again, Russia
but don't you feel that at some point Putin can become the next Gaddafi?
Putin or Sadat or Assad? Sorry,
all of them.
All of them. Well, you see, this is, I would say, complicated. And I know many people, some of them are famous, with whom I had talks during all these years, who usually would ask me a question, well, how long do you think Putin would be able to survive? And my answer, since 2000, I do remember this. We had this conversation very often with Berezovsky, by the way. Since 2000, I was trying to tell and to explain that Putin is very real and he is there for a very long time. And I have my reasoning for this. You see, Putin came to power not as dictator, and even now I do not consider him to be a dictator like Hitler, like Mussolini, like Stalin. Putin came to power on behalf of a very powerful structure. The name of the structure was known those years as KGB, now it is known as the FSB. But Putin is ruling Russia on behalf of a huge corporation, and the name of this corporation is the FSB. And they control Russia quite successfully, basically everything. They control economy, they control bank system, they control elections. There is no freedom of press. The opposition are not just not united, but it's not united for a reason. It's not united because the FSB effectively doesn't allow it to be united. When some leaders become very dangerous, like Boris Nemtsov, they kill them. So the system is very effective. It's managed to, unlike during the Soviet years when KGB existed within the close borders of the Soviet state and without market economy, the current FSB, which rules Russia, managed to keep the borders open, to have market economy. And this basically allowed, of course, this allows those people who hate regime just to leave Russia, because there is more chances, of course, to emigrate than to fight against the regime. Those who do not want to leave Russia and would like to be actively, would like actively to fight against the regime, like Nemtsov, are killed. So I do not see any reason for this system to collapse very soon. The elections which are going to take place in 2018, I'm sure Putin would win very easily. He is trying nevertheless, on the way to these elections of 2018, to clean the road for him. So those elections are going to be a formality, and not only he is killing people like Boris Nemtsov, who might try to compete with him for the presidency, but he is also taking down, fires, replacing his major friends from KGB, like General Viktor Ivanov or General Sergei Ivanov, who was until recently in charge of the administration of the president. This is the second powerful position in the Russian government after president, the position of the president. At the same time, he is creating National Guards, a new structure which is probably going to be something like personal military, institute under the leadership of personally the president of Russia. So he's working quite hard to be sure that no enemies are going to be met on this road to elections of 2018. Not speaking of the fact that if the elections are rigged somewhere, this is definitely in Russia, not in the United States. So nothing is going to, be dangerous for Putin in the near future, unless he will go for the open military conflict with the United States. Then this will backfire, of course.
Well, then I would I would like to, I guess, summarize first, because I wanted to make sure that I got your answer to this question, and that is what to do about Russia. And you said the sanctions are too little, too late. So does it mean that sanctions, yes, but then also the emphasis should be on strengthening NATO?
Well, as usual, if first of all you have to have a political program, meaning that the United States should understand and should formulate what actually they would like to see in Russia or to do with Russia. So far, this program doesn't exist. You know probably quite well that in Washington, D.C., if you ever talk to people, you will find that many of them think that, well, we actually should just give up to Russia as much as it's necessary to give up in order to be friends with Russia, because it's expensive not to be friendly with Russia. Or you will find more people probably in Pentagon who would say that Russia is strategic enemy and we should increase funding of NATO and we should increase the army. And by the way, this is happening. You know, the result of 2014 invasion of Crimea and Ukraine is that the United States budget towards NATO in Europe was tripled. America is spending more money. America is deploying more troops in Europe. So this is happening, and this is happening because Russia is becoming very, very aggressive. But in the beginning, you have to understand what you actually would like to do with Putin regime. And by the way, speaking about all this pre-election rhetoric, we didn't hear anybody saying about the regime of Russia which should be changed because it's dangerous for the world. It is dangerous for the world, but no one is thinking about doing something in order to change it. Now, if you really want to change the regime in Russia, it is very, very simple. I mean, if you really want to introduce tough sanctions or any sanctions, all you need to do is to start to sell liquid gas to Europe and decrease Europeans' dependency on Russian gas. There are a lot of instruments in the United States which the United States has in its power to decrease prices for oil if this actually is necessary. And by doing this, of course, killing Russia's ability to use, to earn more money, spending more money for military programs. What is happening in Russia? By the way, Russia is increasing military budget. And if we look at prices of oil and compare them with the activity of the Russian foreign policy, we will see that every time oil goes higher than $100 per barrel, Russia invades another country. This happens in 2008 when they invaded Georgia. This too happened in 2014 when they invaded Ukraine. In both cases, prices for oil were dramatically high, and Russia was earning a lot of extra money for its budget. So
this reminds me of I have a friend who every time he has money, he gets a tattoo.
Well,
and, I had money here, I had money there. So every time the oil price goes to over $100, Russia invades, and that's something to remember.
Well, it is very easy to remember. In other words, every time Russia has money, it's using it to enlarge the empire. And that's unfortunately the only conclusion which I would do if I'm in Washington, D.C., that we actually should be sure that Russia is not getting a lot of money or not enough of money for both oil and gas. And those prices are easily to control in today's world, especially prices for gas. But once again, no one in Washington, D.C., and I repeat, no one has an idea to fight Russia or to weaken Russia. No one has this agenda. Everybody would like to see Russia as a peaceful, partner which helps the United States and the rest of the world to deal with other major topics. And those major topics, as we all know, would obviously include fighting against international Muslim terrorism. The other question is whether Russia indeed is involved in provoking this Muslim terrorism. But this is a completely separate and very difficult topic.
Okay, so I was wrong. It's not China, it's the international terrorism. All
well,
right.
I would say it's not China. You see, China, we are quote-unquote Europeans. I do not know what does this say about us. But this probably tells us that we do not really understand China, and we probably have a lot of difficulties to understand China. Now, from the United States or from Europe, China looks as if it's a united, nation of Chinese people who are ready to take the world. I'm not sure that this is precisely the case. First of all, China, the modern China, is a very young state. It was created actually, after the Second World War. Then China, of course, Chinese people look the same for us, but indeed they speak different languages. And China is a kind of federation or an empire. And all empires, as we know, have tendency, to destroy itself from time to time. Then from the experience which we see when we deal with Chinese foreign policy, we see that unlike the Soviet Union or unlike Russia, which would try to use any opportunity to take another state or to take another territory, Chinese actually do not see their advantages, through extension of the territory. We see that they were waiting 100 years before they peacefully received back Hong Kong. We see that they never tried to occupy Taiwan, although Taiwan is definitely a Chinese territory, much more Chinese than Crimea is Russian. So I would be very careful thinking that Chinese, we do have, unfortunately, I have to say, a case of open aggression, which America recognized as an open aggression, is the building of artificial island in the South China Sea. This is the fact, and this is very sad fact for the American foreign policy. And in the recent manual of NATO, which is a kind of simple program, who is friend and who is not, three institutions are named as strategic enemies of the United States. International terrorism and ISIS, Russia because of occupation of eastern Ukraine and Crimea, and China because of the construction of the artificial island with the goal to control the sea around it. So it's not that we are illusional about China, but I never believed and do not believe now in a Russian-Chinese union against whatever, including the United States.
Okay.
This I do not see, this I do not buy. I know that there are a lot of specialists who are afraid precisely of this. And recently, as we know, the president of Indonesia, I believe, announced that that's precisely what they are going to build, a union of three countries against the United States.
Philippines, I believe.
Philippines, I'm sorry, Philippines, of course. This actually confirms my statement that being a European, I make this, stupid mistake.
No, this is perfectly fine. Let me ask you then this in conclusion to kind of maybe this is very interesting and very much appreciate your time, Yuri. We know from watching, having watched Soviet Union, how much they were involved in fostering these totalitarian regimes around the world, and as well as groups that were fighting and causing all sorts of problems all over the world. You know how much support in various forms came from Soviet Union, and in part, but how. What about just if the regime in Russia changes, wouldn't that have a domino effect of addressing all these extremists that have been enjoying Russian support in Europe and perhaps elsewhere? Then maybe we need to go, rather than deal with each symptom, look at the main cause of the situation, which is funding, albeit gas and oil funding for all of these extremists.
Well, we mentioned that Russia today has more spies all over the world than the Soviet Union was allowed itself to have. This is partially because Russia, being a part of market economy, has much more money now to spend to undermine the rest of the world, and that's what they do. We see it in the United States. We see it through the creation of dozens, maybe even hundreds of organizations which are sponsored by the Russian government abroad, with the idea that those organizations would be a kind of pro-Russian instruments which sooner or later might be used by the Russian government. We do know, in other words, that Russia is using money as a very powerful instrument. Unfortunately, it's not that they do it only secretly, they do it quite openly, and the well-known case would be, for example, the case of former Chancellor of Germany, Schröder, who is officially getting money from Gazprom, which is a Russian state company, openly, working for the Russian interests and for the Russian government. And you see, that's where the problem is. Unless you declare that Russia is a strategic enemy or ideological enemy or propagandistic enemy, it seems to be that taking money from Russia, whether we're talking about political leaders of foreign countries or political institutions like political parties in France, for example, it seems to be fine. There is no law technically which doesn't allow you to take money from the Russian government because it's not prohibited. It's not prohibited because no one says the Russian government is an enemy, and this is a circle. This is a very there is of course a fine border and line which people try not to cross, otherwise they would become spies, would be seen as spies in their native countries. But unfortunately, in contemporary world, even the spying, definition of spying changed. And this has a lot to do with the internet and with open sources and with WikiLeaks and with the ability of other people to, ruin another computers and steal emails. So punishments change. We remember that story when 10 Russian spies were illegals, actually, were arrested in in the United States, and prior to 91, all of them would end in jail and probably would be, servicing long sentences. But now they just sent back to Russia, actually, because even Americans do not want to make a big deal about these 10 spies arrested in one day. There are many spies. What are you going to do with them? I mean, do you arrest them, send them back? Do you arrest them, sentence them? It's very difficult to prove that they were spying. They would probably indicate that what they were doing, just, reading internet. So it's today's world is very much different from the world where we were living 10 years ago and 20 years ago and 30 years ago. And this is the problem. We look differently at things, and that's why even Russia is seen differently today, because, as I mentioned, not too many people would agree that Russia is an enemy, or a lot of politicians would be very careful to say that Russia is an enemy. They would say that, well, Russia is a difficult partner, and we hope that Russia would become a friend one day. And we all hope that Russia may become a friend one day. But I'm afraid that for this, we have to see the change of regime in Russia.
On that note, Yuri Felshtinsky, thank you so much for being on Rashkin Report. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.